Okay. All right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good morning.
Good morning.
Outstanding. My name is Father Michael Marcantonio. I'm the priest here at St. Constantine and Ellen Greek Orthodox Church in Middletown, Ohio. I want to thank all of you for coming out today and for coming and being part of the prayers at the beginning, as well as getting the fellowship and know one another at breakfast. This is a phenomenal start to a beautiful day that we hope will leave you better equipped to face the difficulties and the pressures that come with trying to hold the ancient Orthodox faith in the context of the modern world. Now, in our advertisement and as our flyers, the express target, right, was holding up under those pressures, specifically in modern academia. But the reality is, as we go out into our jobs, as we go out into our neighborhoods, our communities, and the relationships that we form throughout life, the challenges and the pressures towards our integrity as Orthodox Christians and what we mean by that. When we face any of those things, that's something that we face throughout life. And it's expected. It's the sort of thing that Christ speaks about in the Gospels. Now, he speaks about it in very strong terms. He says, "Lo, you will be hated by all for my name's sake." Or he speaks about being drugged before the authorities of the synagogues and the power brokers of the given day to give an accounting for the gospel because of the sake of the Son of Man. And that doesn't always look like being drugged out in front of an actual tribunal. What it can look like is getting grilled by your coworkers, being ostracized by your peer group. The reality is we face pressures and challenges as the price tag of being sincere, honest, Orthodox Christians. So, why would we bother doing any of this? There's really only one reason to be an Orthodox Christian. And that's because it's true. Period, stop. We're Orthodox Christians because it is true. It is truth in the fullness of truth. Now, we may talk about how to express that truth. We may talk about how to understand or how to even apply and what to do with that truth. But it's not a simple matter of custom, and it's not because it's comforting, and it's not because of any one of our wonderful backgrounds, all of which are very good. It's simply because, front, middle, and center, this is true. That the most holy Trinity is God, eternal, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the second person of that Trinity took flesh of the ever-Virgin Mary, crucified, died, and was buried, and thrown at the right hand of the Father, and coming again at the end of the days. What we say as Orthodox Christians is true. Now, how to apply that and what to do with that in real time and in the world, that's more complicated, and life is complicated. Because we have to hold up under pressure, and because those ideas will be pressure tested, I want us to start out with that bedrock. This is true. We're not trying to figure out whether it's true or not, it is. So if Orthodoxy is what we say it is, and Christianity is what we say it is, what do we do next? And the good news is that when something is pressure tested, whether it's in academia or our work or our relationships or our job or wherever, whatever is pressure tested comes out stronger for it. Comes out a little bit clearer. And so I want to, before I turn it over to Father Lucas to speak about that, I want to share you a brief story about that. St. Justin Martyr, he was one of the early saints of the church. He died. He lived around 125, so he died somewhere, 130-ish, I think. I could be wrong. But he was a philosopher before he became a Christian. And as a philosopher, they were constantly asking what is true. And he noticed that these Orthodox women and children were being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. And they were facing down certain death with a serenity and a courage that he had never seen from grown men before. He said, he looked at these, just, again, we're not talking scholars, we're talking ordinary women and children who approach the Orthodox Christian faith from the standpoint of this is true, even unto death. And he looked at that and he said, these Christians don't live or die like other men. What is it that they have? And that led him to joining their ranks. He's the one who gives us the saying patristically, that whatever has been spoken of rightly among all men, whatever has been said in truth, is the property of us Christians. Because of the idea that there is no truth that does not come from Christ, if in fact it is true. So, in that same spirit, his life changed. He became a Christian. He lived and ended his life as a Christian because it was true. And we live in a world that asks, much like Pilate at Christ's trial, what is truth? So that's the pressure that we're under. And so I want to equip you all to face that pressure a little bit better, so that it might be said of you that these Christians do not live like other men. There is something different there. What is this truth that they have that makes their life somehow other, somehow more authentic, that integrity that we don't see everywhere else? And that's the property of truth. And it stands on its own. You don't have to prove it, you just have to show it. It's a beautiful thing, and it holds up under pressure without fail. So I want to invite my good friend, Father Lucas Christensen, to speak to us about holding up the Orthodox Christian faith under the challenges and pressure testing of modern academia, in the hopes that that truth might shine a little bit brighter. I invited Father Lucas not just because he is a wonderful priest and a good friend, but also he himself has had to do this very task. He is a PhD candidate at Notre Dame, and as such, his very ideas at all times are being pressure tested by his peers and by scholars who come before him. But having also done his undergraduate work, having also done seminary, that is a master's in education, what he holds as true has had to hold up under the pressures of modern academia, under the pressures of family life, under the strains of career, and the culture that we live in. So I feel greatly blessed that he has been able to join us today and help equip us to meet that challenge a little bit better. So without further gilding of the lily, Father, the floor is yours, and I want to thank you so much for being. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father. The Apostle Paul, when he was on his way to persecute the early church, as he had been doing, was confronted with a vision of our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. And in that confrontation with a vision of Christ, the absolute revelation of the truth that the Most High God is Jesus Christ, the one that he had been fighting against, Paul came to a very hard realization very quickly. But that wasn't the end of what Paul did. He didn't simply say, well, that's that, and then pack up his things and just go make tents for the rest of his life. He did make tents. But what he did immediately after that was he spent 3 years studying, examining, praying over the scriptures, which at that time were what we now call the Old Testament, the Greek or Hebrew Bible. He would have been looking at that in order to understand who Christ is. And so we have a saying in my department, the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. Our motto is faith-seeking understanding. And that motto, I like it. It's something that's not exactly unique to us, but I like it because it encapsulates what we see in Paul, and it encapsulates what we see over the trajectory of the church's history, which is, we have the faith which is given to us. We have that which we receive from God himself, oftentimes through prophets, apostles, on down to us. But it isn't something that anyone devised through careful calculations. It isn't something that somebody said, wouldn't it be neat if God were actually three persons? Nobody comes up with that. Because in the face of it, it seems absurd. How can one God be three persons? It is something that is revealed, and it isn't something that we get to discover by our own mental processes. But what's beautiful is having been revealed, as Paul has done, then we get to engage. We get to engage in study. We get to engage what has been revealed to us in order to understand as best we can through our meager human powers. It's something the church has done over the centuries. Anytime, it's usually actually in the face of a problem. Anytime a heresy has come up in the church, a heresy may be that Jesus Christ is only a human, but he's not divine. The church comes together and, guided by the Holy Spirit, deliberate over this. What have we received from the apostles, and how can we express this clearly using our God-given intellect? Over and over again, this has happened. We commemorate at least 7 ecumenical councils where this has happened. It is faith which is received. It isn't devised. Seeking understanding, seeking to understand the things that God has revealed to us. And so, we find that in this encounter with a challenge, we are given an opportunity which we could see as a threat. And so the first thing that I have on these handouts that I've given to you, I want you to take a moment either to write down or at least to think about. If you don't feel like writing, because I don't want it to feel like homework, but I do want to give you the opportunity. And sometimes when we physically write out something, we actually remember it better. Take just 5 minutes to write out, how do we typically view a challenge? And maybe, how could we view a challenge? So please just take a few minutes, write that down. Feel free to talk with your neighbor. We're going to have breakout sessions as well, but feel free. We're going to take a moment, and then I want to hear from you, and then we're going to talk about that. free to finish up if you're still learning. So how do we view challenge? How do we view challenges? Who's willing to share anything? Yes, sir.
To me, my lifetime challenge is also growth.
Challenge is also growth. Fantastic. That's good. We'll get back to that. Thank you. Challenge. Who else would like to share? Yes.
No, I think we need to challenge we need to have the right reference point for what challenges. Like, it doesn't have to be negative.
Okay, so with the right references,
So
only.
like school is challenging. Higher education is challenging. My relationship with my wife can be challenging. And ideally, we're coming out better on the other side. Countering this challenge.
Okay, so similarly, challenge a positive thing can be challenging as well. Our relationships are challenging. I'm repeating what you're saying for everybody and also for the camera, which I'm not in front of right now. So that we're given these opportunities for growth that all are much more positive than I anticipate. Yes.
So, how will they view challenge? Well, that's what they possibly have on a specific challenge, but in any case, it's going to be something that requires effort, personal investment.
So it's going to require effort and personal investment.
Yes, it's going to be something that you actually have to put yourself into, rather than just something that it's anything from the challenge, just getting out the way in the morning.
Sure. Or we can run away from it.
Or we can
run away from it.
But if it's but if it's a challenge, then you're usually accepting it. Otherwise, it's just something.
All right. Other thoughts on challenge? Yes, sir.
Meeting a desired things,
Okay.
which requires effort.
I'm going to repeat that. Meeting a desired end state. All right. Good. Good. No negative ones?
I put down the opposing views.
Opposing views? Okay, so opposition. Challenge can be about confrontation. Okay.
Trying to get others to think the way.
Okay, get it. Trying to bring others to your point of view.
I echoed what others said about opportunity for movement, but also risk for failure.
Risk of failure. Risk of failure, absolutely. Okay. So here's the thing. I'm going to posit that if most of us are like most other people, a challenge can either be seen as a threat or an opportunity. The possibility of failure may be threatening to us. The challenging of our ideas may be threatening to us. We can see challenge as potential for calamity, right? But, as has also been shared here, challenges are opportunities. They're opportunities for growth. They're opportunities to excel. They are opportunities to grow through failure as well. Because failure itself can be a challenge which we meet by getting back up and trying again. And so, I'm emphasizing this so much because when we come to this idea of challenge as an opportunity for growth, we realize throughout the history of the church, we've been doing this. In the beginning, Christ is challenged by the scribes and the Pharisees, and we see he engages them. And they're constantly in awe of the way he engages them. He's given a cross, and he meets the challenge of death by bringing life into death itself. And in the early church, as Father touched on the story of St. Justin, the philosopher and martyr, the church is challenged by the threat of martyrdom, and it meets it head on. And what ended up happening? The very empire that was killing the Christians converts to Christianity. Every challenge, when it can be met head on with faith and resolve, it won't necessarily lead to anything we would consider a worldly paradigm of success. Children being killed because they refuse to renounce Christ is nothing like a paradigm of worldly success. But it is a paradigm, it's an image, it's a pattern of success in the eyes of the kingdom of heaven. And so every challenge can be seen as a threat, but it can also be seen as an opportunity to grow in faith. Here's the problem. If it's a real challenge, however, it's not one we immediately know how we're going to face. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. It's easy to talk about this in the abstract with you and me right here. We're fairly comfortable. We've got the air conditioning, thanks be to God. We're doing well. We're not being actively persecuted by the state who wants to make sure that we cannot assemble and pray to God and learn about God. But we have relatives that are in countries that are that way. And so the challenges we face right now are a little bit more subtle, right? The challenges we face may not be, guess what? If I try to go to the Divine Liturgy, I may be arrested. I'm going to go in. Because in many countries where Christianity is openly persecuted, that's exactly what's happening. The challenges we face tend to be more along the lines of, yeah, but the idea of God is ridiculous on the face of it. How could you, an apparently intelligent person, believe in such a silly thing? This is the sort of challenge that we oftentimes face. Now, in our headline, The Challenges of Modern Academia, we have to be very clear, and we have to dispel some myths. And so now I circle back a little bit to the biographical piece. And I didn't want to start with the biographical. It sounded a little too self-congratulatory or too much about me. I'm entering in my second year of PhD study in theology at the University of Notre Dame. My specialization is not necessarily philosophy and these patterns of thoughts we're talking about today, but it is something I engage with. What I study is liturgy, specifically how we worship in the various services and the ways that we do so. And then within that, I particularly look at sacred art, sacred architecture, and preaching. So I'm interested in the way that we worship, how it works together, in order to reveal to us the presence of God and our presence in the kingdom of heaven when we come to worship. But not everybody believes that. Not everybody accepts that when we come together, we actually stand in the presence of God. Obviously, there are challenges to that idea, that the way that we worship and the pattern of our worship actually matters at all. That what we're doing actually matters more than anything else we could be doing. When we are in worship, we're doing the most important thing we could be doing. That isn't to make other things unimportant, but it is the single most concentrated important thing. And for others, it's not important at all. And it may, in fact, be dangerous because it's distracting us from other things. It is a challenge to an idea, which then is an invitation to engage that idea, to see and seek and to understand how can we talk about this, and how can we as a church, and how can I, as a scholar, present a reasonable account for why we worship, for how we worship, for what worship reveals to us, for what worship does through us. In the academy, we have this nature of the challenge, which you'll note if you're following along in your handout is the second part. The nature of the challenge is actually mainly one of critical inquiry. What do I mean by that? Critical inquiry, as I'm using it today, is this idea that we're not going to assume you are right. We're not going to assume that when you say, or I say, well, this is how it is, that it's just actually the way that it is. We actually need to investigate that. We need to look into it. We need to understand how does it come together? What are the historical circumstances? What evidence do we have of how something came to be? How do we understand the social context in which that happened, the historical, and certainly the theological? Critical inquiry says you have to do better than that to explain to me how and what you believe. And it is a question that, on the face of it, simply on its own, is not threatening. Although it may feel threatening, it is not threatening to us. And this gets at what Father Michael was saying earlier. We know that we possess the truth because we didn't come up with it, we received it. We're the beneficiaries of the truth in Jesus Christ incarnate. And if we are stewards, I wouldn't say possessors, I'll correct myself. If we're stewards of the truth, then nothing can threaten us. No honest and earnest critical inquiry into the church's identity, teaching, and practice can actually threaten us because we know that we're on the side of the truth. So then, we have to understand critical inquiry is an opportunity, and the reason why we oftentimes feel threatened may be twofold. One, our faith is challenged, and we're not actually certain that we do possess the truth. This isn't really something to be ashamed of. It happens all the time. It's an opportunity for reflection. It's an opportunity to look inward and to say, clearly I feel threatened by this. That may mean that I'm insecure. I'm unsure of the truth of this. It is a time for prayer. It's also a time for study. Because the other reason why we might feel threatened by critical inquiry is because even if we're sure of the truth, we really don't know how to defend the truth, to explain the truth, to investigate the truth, to present the truth. And this is why study is such an important historic discipline in the church. Now I'm focusing on theology because that's my area. It's important for you to be able to take this and to apply it to what you're doing. One of the ways in which we find ourselves engaged in critical inquiry is the church's teaching about the human person. This is all the rage. The way that we understand the human person's orientations and identities is something that is in a period of intense flux right now. And here is something that is important for the Christian to understand. When we look at the human person, science, as a point of critical inquiry, is no threat to the Christian because what we're examining is the human person insofar as we can understand the processes of biology and what we can observe and what we can know by what we observe. But what we observe is the consequence of a fallen world. What do I mean? Well, when we consider the fact that Adam and Eve are created according to the Genesis account, and they're in paradise with God, after they are cast out, they and all creation fall into a state of decay, into a state of disrepair. Things don't work as they ought. Our desires are not oriented as they ought to be. Humanity is not oriented toward God. Humanity is oriented toward its own desires and its own sense of gratification and self-fulfillment. That's a bare statement of the facts. But I cannot say as a result of that, that's how we should be. Well, people are self-absorbed, so obviously we're meant to be self-absorbed. It's just the way we are. It is the way we are. It's not the way we're called to be, we're meant to be. And so the first thing to understand is in this world, what we can observe and know by observing this world is it in its fallenness. Not in the way that it's meant to be. That's a faith proposition, or that is a proposition that comes by way of revelation. It isn't something that we can simply demonstrate, that we can simply prove by making sure that you can see, well, I'm going to take you back in a time machine and show you humanity before the fall. But this comes to our next little point, and I've actually provided the definition in text because one, I wanted it so I can read it aloud, and two, it may be helpful for you to have. What we need to understand is when someone challenges us in order to be able to say, well, you can't prove to me the factualness that we are fallen, you can't prove to me that we're not working the way that we're meant to be. Oftentimes, this is presented to us as if this is some kind of a neutral position. This is presented to us as, well, it's a neutral thing to say you can only know what you can observe through this study of the world as we can see it, as we can hear it, touch it, taste it, measure it. That's all we can know. That, brothers and sisters, we've come to believe because we breathe that air and we drink that water. We kind of think of that as our default position. That, well, that's neutral. And then religion is somehow added to that. And the first thing we have to understand as we meet the challenges is what we really can't dialogue with. And the first is the idea of positivism. Positivism is a theory that theology and metaphysics, that is a spiritual understanding of the world, are earlier and imperfect modes of knowledge, or completely valueless modes of knowledge, and that reliable knowledge is based on natural phenomena and their properties, and relations is verified by what we might call the empirical sciences. That is our ability to observe, to weigh, to measure, to test, to reproduce in testing. That's the only reliable way of knowing. Does that sound familiar? Right? Prove it to me. Show me. Demonstrate it. And if you can't, then I'm not going to believe it. This idea, this positivism, is itself a philosophical and to a degree a theological position. Why is it important for us to understand this? It's essential for us to understand that it is a position because it's not neutral. Right? If it's not neutral, then the person with whom we're talking or the entity we're talking with has their own religious viewpoint they're bringing to bear. It's not purely science because science has nothing to say about the spiritual world. Right? Positive or negative. Not as science. And so when we come up against this idea that you can only know what you can observe and weigh and measure, not only is it somewhat absurd because we claim to know all sorts of things that we can't necessarily weigh, observe, measure, but also we have to understand that person has to establish, for the sake of our conversation, why that is the only way to know. Are you with me? This is kind of a challenging idea. The reason it's challenging is because I'm basically trying to describe water or fish. We're all swimming in this. And I'll give you an example in just a little bit of why we're swimming in this, or what that means. Positivism is linked to positivism really has to do with the way that we know. Materialism has to do with the way the world is. Materialism is a theory that physical matter is the only reality. I'll say that again. Physical matter, the stuff, is the only reality. And that all being and processes and phenomena can be explained as manifestations or results of matter. To put it in Plato terms, which is why you have extra lines, there's no spiritual world. There's no spiritual world beyond this physical, material, observable world. So they're linked because if I'm a materialist, then I believe the only way I can know about anything is by observing the material. All that can exist and can exist is that. And so when you come across people who say there is no God, and they will say something absurd, which any real scientist would never be able to accept, and say, I believe in science. Right? Well, science is no enemy of the church or of the faith, because science is simply a system whereby we do weigh, measure, and try to guess about and then test our guesses, our hypotheses, about the physical world. There's no problem with that. The problem is actually when they depart from science and begin to leave science in order to make theological claims and philosophical claims in the name of science, when it is not really science. If I begin to say, well, there is no God, no scientist, as a scientist, can make that claim. Because we could then reverse and say, well, proof there's no God. Through your weighing, through your measuring, through your observations, through your testing, and it can't be done. Because that's not how this works. And so, to bring all of this back together before we take a brief break, 15-minute break, and I'm going to give you the rundown of how the rest of the day is going to go. The first thing we have to understand is we are challenged. We're presented challenges to what we believe and how we act and how we believe things ought to work. But the challenge needn't to be seen as a threat, but as an opportunity. Even if those two things that I mentioned earlier are true, even if our faith is a little bit shaken, we find when we become not secure in faith, that's an opportunity to turn to God in prayer, to turn to God for spiritual growth. That's an opportunity, too, if we find I feel threatened because I don't know how to answer this. It's an opportunity to seek greater understanding through spiritual study, through talking to those who do know, in order to strengthen our own understanding and to be able to engage that challenge. If we do those things, we will have grown, and our ability to share the faith will have grown. The other thing to understand is we can absolutely engage any level of honest and earnest critical inquiry. Doesn't mean we're going to be able to answer everything. There are things that are frustratingly difficult to answer. In my own discipline, how exactly did the apostles worship? I wish I knew. Just don't have the texts. We have a general idea of the shape of their worship, but beyond that, I couldn't tell you. And that frustrates me to no end. But it is what it is. We move on. But there are things we absolutely can know. Somebody says to us, why do you worship the way that big golden book in your service? Walk around and then go back in. Why? Why does he do that? Does anybody know? The reason why, if you're interested, because this is actually what I do, is because originally that was when we were first coming into the church from outside. Everything that came before, we were singing on our way to church as a community, processing through the streets. Nobody was driving, obviously. This is 1,500 years ago. Everyone was processing through the streets on their way to church, together with the bishop and all the clergy, and all the people, and they're all singing things like, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Mortal, have mercy on us. Or through the intercessions of the Theotokos, O Savior, save us. And they're singing them as they come in. And as they come into church for the first time, they stop at the door, right outside of church, and the bishop says the entrance prayer. Blessed is the entrance of your holy ones, always known forever unto ages of ages. And then they come in. Come, let us worship and bow down before Christ, our God. Save us, the Son of God. If in some way we're risen from the dead. It was the first entrance into church. Well, over time we stopped doing that. Everybody coming in at the same time. Ended up that those hymns we were singing on the way were incorporated into liturgy itself. And so instead of having a formal entry, everybody together, the clergy come out and then enter in to prepare for what will be the scripture readings. How do we know that? Well, some people took it into their minds to say, why do we do this? Critical inquiry. Why do we do this sort of U-turn thing? And the critical inquiry was met with study. They engaged manuscripts, really old manuscripts, which explained exactly what they were supposed to be doing back in the day. And it turned out they were all walking through the streets of Constantinople, and they were all coming together wherever they happened to be serving, worshiping together. Critical inquiry could have been seen as a threat. Well, why do we do that? Because we've always done it, right? Because we've always done it that way. That's the answer. Okay. That's not the answer. The answer is because it's the way we do it now, which we've inherited in its particular form, but it still reveals to us the fact that we are continually entering into the kingdom of God. And we're entering in. And we're entering in throughout the course of liturgy. A critical question, honestly and earnestly asked, leads to that. But then a question, to reiterate my final point before we break, a question that says something like, why do you do all of that when there's no God to hear your prayers? That's what we call a loaded question. It assumes there's no God. And we don't have to anymore, now that we know all this, and for some of us, it's just review. We don't have to pretend that's a neutral position, like, oh, well, this person has the neutral position of there's no God. And now I have to, explain why I added God to all this. No. Because as soon as somebody assumes, whether they say it that way or they say it in a more subtle way, as soon as somebody assumes there's no one to whom we're praying, no one real whom we're worshiping, then we actually have a different conversation. Well, how do you come by the knowledge that there is no God? Oh, well, just science. Science doesn't say anything about God. So how do you come by the knowledge and the belief that there is no God? That's the question that really needs to be addressed. That's the conversation that really needs to happen. Well, why do you believe that dunking an infant in water 3 times does anything? Well, we believe that the Holy Spirit comes and sanctifies the waters and causes that person to be crucified, buried, and risen with Christ and engrafted into his body. Oh, well, it's just water. How do you know that? How do you come by the knowledge that it's just water? At that point, neither of us can prove anything to the other, but at least we've exposed the fact that neither of us is in a position of metaphysical neutrality or theological neutrality. Each of us is making a theological claim, and then we can have a conversation. It's important to understand this because the challenges that we can meet are the honest and earnest ones. The challenges that have underlying assumptions are still things we can engage, but not as their friends. We can't engage somebody who says, well, if God created somebody this way, then who are you to say no? I would say, hold on, there are some underlying assumptions there. I would disagree that God created someone specifically this way. I believe that God created us, and we have fallen, and these things happen. If my desires are disordered and coming back to myself for my own self-aggrandizement, for my own pride, then I believe that that's a result of fallenness. And so we need to first ask, why am I fallen? Why am I self-absorbed? Why am I interested only in pleasing myself? That's the real question. And so, it's still an opportunity, but it's an opportunity to go deeper and to help our friend, our co-worker, our colleague, our family member, to at least to understand, hey, you're going to believe what you're going to believe. I can't disprove everything. But I'm at least going to help you to understand that you're not in this position of complete neutrality into pure rational belief because you're making metaphysical, theological, philosophical claims. And we can have a discussion about that. But we need to understand that it's something to discuss. So, for the rest of the day, I don't want to just talk at you. I do want to encourage hands up. I want to encourage more of this. I want to encourage breakout sessions. We're going to take a 15-minute break. That's not only to water and do whatever else you do, but I hope that over the break, I would like you to consider, how do you experience critical inquiry in your life? How are you experiencing that? From friends, colleagues, co-workers, family members? Which of those kind of challenges that you're getting are actually a result of a point of view called positive, a point of view that we can really only know the material world? Which of those points of view have to do with the fact that we're just animals? We're just physical beings, there's no spiritual reality to us, and how we are is who we are. I would like to invite you to talk with one another, and I'll be mingling. Again, if you need to go wherever, that's fine, but I'd like this to be an opportunity for us to chat with one another about what we've just been saying, so that after that break we'll wrap up this first portion. We'll do hopefully some Q&A as part of that, and then wrapping up this idea, and then queuing up something we call postmodernity. And that may scare you, and that might not scare you. You may not know what that is, and that's fine. Because if you did, I wouldn't have anything to talk about. Then, after we do the wrap-up, we're going to break for lunch at 12:45. And then we'll have about an hour for lunch, and then we're going to go to session 2. Session 2, so this beginning has all been very theoretical, and you may be thinking, oh my goodness, what did I get into? Or you may be thinking, oh, I already knew all of this. Bravo, good for you. But in session 2, we're going to get more practical. We're going to be talking about how do we engage. And I'm going to need I'm going to need more engagement. You're not doing it wrong. I'm just saying we're going to do more engagement. We're going to talk about practical scenarios. We're going to talk about how Father says how the rubber meets the road. Because the fact of the matter is, it's all different. How I am engaging when I'm looking at a manuscript is very different from how you're engaging when your neighbor says, well, I don't understand why you have a problem, with this or that or the other thing. I think you're just silly. And so those are very different ideas. We want to talk about these kinds of practical things. And so I look forward to that. And then after the second session, we'll have a general Q&A. So it can go beyond the scope of the immediate topic. We can be on things that we didn't really touch on. And then we'll close with Vespers. Vespers is a beautiful service. If you've not been to it, it's a beautiful service with some psalms, some beautiful hymns, and it's just a lovely little service that will close out our time together. So at this time, I'd invite you to get up, move around. We'll come back together in about 15 minutes, which puts us at 12:25. So, God bless.
Can I raise my hand?
Yeah, of course.
When you were talking about positivism, this is actually something I've thought about quite a bit. And I wanted to say, as not to contradict anything that you said, but to sort of as an addendum, point out that it's a profoundly hypocritical philosophy.
Oh, of course.
Because nobody on earth knows things exclusively by empirical testing. Have you ever been to Venice?
I've not been to Venice.
Okay, no, you've never been there. How do you know it exists?
Yeah, right. Because that's exactly right. Because you take a lot of things on.
You take everything on faith. Your entire schooling is taking things on faith over and over and over and over.
Although I will say this, and not that I believe in positivism, but in terms of having a better engagement with them. I mean, and I don't know if anybody really believes in positivism, but it's an underlying framework.
Yeah.
Because the things they'll say, well, somebody else has been, and then they relate to me.
Yeah, but that's the same as a Christian saying that we've received this truth from God.
Yes.
Somebody else found truth, or in God's case, created it. It flows from Him.
Yeah.
And then delivered it to us. That's the same statement.
I agree, which is why I'm not a positivist.
But I when people say, oh, the only way you can know that or prove it or empirically test it, it's like, have you actually tested E equals MC squared? Have you done the work to make sure that that's actually true? How do you know it's true? People take things, including all the people who are all about that sort of positivist, we need to not take things on faith, we need to empirically test everything. They take things on faith every day, all the time, without even thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You get into a car that you don't know, and you believe that it will run, and it will not just explode.
Or, you believe that when you see a picture of Venice, that's a picture of Venice. It's not a digitally created falsehood to convince you that there is a place called Venice when there really isn't.
Right. It's like the moon landing deniers.
Yes.
And the thing is, they're actually exhibiting the sort of absurd consequences of this thinking, which is, well, I've not been on the moon, therefore I don't have to.
Or flat earthers.
Right.
If you've not been up high enough in a spaceship to see that the Earth is round, and you haven't done tests like Eratosthenes, who was able to calculate the circumference of the Earth by empirical testing, if you don't have the ability to make those tests or gather that data for yourself, how can you trust it? Well, under empiricism, under positivism, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't trust anything, and you can't even trust your senses because you know your senses lie to you all the time. Every time you see a face in a brick wall because of a odd arrangement of stone, your senses are lying to you.
Yeah. I'm going to circulate just to touch point, but you're right. Positivism is actually nobody truly believes in their heart of hearts because they believe all sorts of things.
Also, if they truly believed it, there would be no need for schools because we could just throw people.
Artists probably so the answer actually this is why is this not actually be there. But actually, this is how I monitor is not like it's not it's like, oh, it's like monitors, because they all believe in truth. It's actually not that simple. Not that they don't believe in truth, but they it's about we're about to the way we come to our experience in our head. We can establish relationships. Keeping the crisis you don't get away from it. That's the thing. No one doesn't. He says, oh, we're going to get around by this. Sorry. There's going to be a question we have not seen. So, yes.
Why don't we start
Yeah. We're trying to test you a little bit, right? And say, this is how this is yourself over. They're aware of the absurdity of nonsense. Things that come out. And so they would say, yeah, you're right. Those who focus on the experience, this is absurd. We're having some great talk, but I also want to reconvene so we can wrap up before we have our lunch. All right, I have 15 minutes to describe postmodern post-narrative, which is fun. All right. I'm kidding. We're not on that kind of schedule. I'm trying to hold myself to account because I could go on and on and on. So what we've described, a lot of what we've described is what's oftentimes called modernism. Modernism sort of encapsulates. I mean, I'm oversimplifying everything because we've got a one-day retreat, and you could spend you could do a whole dissertation on any one of the topics we're touching upon. But to continue my trend of oversimplifying, what we've been talking about, this idea of positivism, we can only know what we can observe. Materialism, all that exists is the material world. it may be that nobody truly believes these things, at least not in practice. Because as we were talking during the break, everyone believes things that they can't just directly observe. We constantly rely on information that we can't have come by through direct observation. And there are things that people would have to be able to point to that may transcend the idea of material. But even if they contradict these beliefs, the fact of the matter is these are still beliefs that run through our cultural consciousness. And this is the real problem, is we've all been breathing the air of modernism and drinking that water. So even we have to consciously fight against it. A good example that is given in order to highlight just how stark this difference is between the pre-modern understanding of the world as being both material and spiritual, and ours, and it assuming always a material cause of something, would include this. Where's my anecdote? No, it went away. That's okay. I remember. So, St. John Chrysostom, one of the times that he was talking to his congregation, his parish, he gave them the following advice in a homily, just a standard day, not to a select group of parishioners. He said, when you see one of your dead relatives, don't start talking to them, because you don't know if it's actually your relative or if it's a demonic appearance. And if it's your relative, God will make it known, but don't start talking to them. Okay, there's the advice, but I want to back up just a second. Hold on, John. What? When we see our dead relative appear to us? Here's the deal. It was happening. So first of all, it was happening with such great frequency and just sort of a generally accepted thing that happens, that John was able to just say it in a homily. He didn't say, okay, you may have heard on occasion on this island in the Cyclades that Iaga once saw an apparition of the Word of God. No. He's saying, when you see the appearance of your departed loved one, don't start talking to him or her. Meaning it was a general experience, everyone understood it, and no one thought, like Ebenezer Scrooge, that it was just a trick of the stomach that was playing, giving us illusions. This is important because we all know, and most of us were smiling, because we know if we heard that, our first thought would be, really, really sight departed loved one. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a daydream. Maybe it was a hallucination. That would be our go-to. Why? It's not a Christian worldview to say that the spiritual world probably doesn't exist unless we're just confronted with the fact that it has to kind of exist in an idea, more in a sentimental, well, Jesus really lives in our heart, right? That's not a Christian worldview, but it is one that we've sort of had to kind of try to figure out how to shoehorn our faith into this sort of modernist idea that we've inherited. Well, all's not lost. The way that we get around that is to remind ourselves, well, hold on a second. It's actually perfectly reasonable that a departed loved one could appear to us, because we know they are alive in Christ. And we know that the saints do appear to other people in order to bring messages. And so, why couldn't it happen? Why wouldn't it happen? There's actually no reasonable, and I really mean that, there's no reasonable explanation why it wouldn't and couldn't. And it's only our own embedded prejudices against the spiritual world and spiritual phenomena that cause us to think that's really kind of absurd, right? But it's not absurd. If we understand this world to exist as it does, spiritual and physical, intermingling, working together and through one another. I give that illustration, I'm not the first to give it, but I give that illustration as a sort of a litmus test for us to say, oh yeah, I would think that too. That was kind of weird thing to say. And most of us agree, maybe not. If you're from the old world, you might not, because you might have grown up with a pre-modern sensibility. I have had conversations with parishioners who grew up in Greece, in North Africa, in the Middle East. And for them, talking about Panagia and seeing her was like talking about the weather. Because they did, because they talked with her, because it was just the way of life. It was just what they did. So the question is, why don't we? Because we've closed the doors of our perception to these realities due to our prejudices, as much as we wish we didn't have them, due to our prejudices against them. And so we don't perceive them. And we don't have that engagement. When someone says, prove to me, usually the way we would say is, well, go find out for yourself. We were just talking about the idea of Venice, right? During the break, yeah. If you wanted to prove the existence of Venice, you could go there, right? If somebody told you it exists, if you've not been, I hear it's lovely, you could actually go and find out for yourself. And the fact of the matter is, there is a sort of empirical spiritual discipline, which is to pray, to fast, to do acts of mercy, to worship, to study, to be open to the presence of God. And as it happens, when people do those things, they tend to experience God. And they find out for themselves these things are true. And so that leads us to a kind of a conundrum that came up during the break, and it was perfect because it queued up what I wanted to talk about. When we talk about postmodernism, there's no such thing as postmodernism, there's more postmodernisms, which is a very postmodern thing to say. We also swim and live and drink and eat and all of that reality. Because postmodernism, as it's on your sheet, is a reaction to modernism, which rejects, among other things, its Enlightenment rationalism, this idea of positivism and materialism we spent a lot of time on already, and the idea of an empirically derivable universal truth. That's a very fancy way of saying that there is this way that you can prove truth to anyone, anywhere, if you just have the right data set that you can present to them, and oh, look, now you have to believe. Well, 10 minutes on the internet will show you that that is not at all true. If you've ever gotten into an argument with somebody who is so confirmed in his or her biases or beliefs, and the fact is you can present such a great argument, and you can present all this proof, and they'll say, yeah, but I don't believe it. Right? The fact of the matter is, and postmodernism gives us this sort of tool that's very helpful. It can go wrong, but we'll get there. This idea that we all approach our experiences, our experience of reality, our experience of the truth, we approach it through a sort of a lens, a way of seeing the world, right? We approach it through a lens, and a lot of that is conditioned by cultural factors, social factors, our family, our upbringing, our church, right? If, I'm trying to come up with a good concrete example. Well, if you were to show the New York Yankees logo in the middle of Boston, the reaction would be pretty violent and negative. If you were to show it in New York, you'd probably have a positive or a neutral reaction, or just negative because it's New York. But you have a culturally encoded way of responding to the same stimulus, the same input, which is this logo, right? And so you're all in Ohio, so if you showed the big red O to somebody in Michigan, negative reaction. If I waved a banner with a blue, brown, and gold M around here, I probably wouldn't have a lot of friends. And obviously mine's going to be an ND. So there you go. But the point is, these are kind of silly, kind of light, kind of non-inconsequential ways that we react, depending on our culture, our upbringing, how we view these teams or whatever. But we also have when it comes to things like a church. When we see an Orthodox church, we see it, and what do we think? We may think, we may make a cross because it's appropriate, and we may think this is, home, worship, God, holy, communion, Christ, the saints, my family, my wife, my husband, my children, my parents, Those are the kinds of things that are just coming at us because we grew up with it. And this used to be the case, certainly in Indiana, and the reason why we couldn't build a traditional looking Orthodox church for a long time, some American who grew up without any consciousness of it would look at it and think, that's a mosque. And they used to do that. And we used to be persecuted because of it. We formed the HEPA, actually, as a protective agency to defend against such racist overtures. Those are two very different reactions to the same stimulus, the temple, the presence of God's glory, and prejudice, right? And so, postmodernity, among other things, it wants to say, look, we all can look at the same thing, but we're going to look at it through a unique lens that comes to us because of our culture, our upbringing, our own decisions and way of life. I think that's fairly obvious to most of us when we think of it. Modernism didn't believe that. It believed that, there is this objective truth, you could just get at it if you remove the lens. But the problem is there's no removing the lens. You will have one. But here's where it all comes together. I think Father mentioned in the bit in the Passion narrative where Pilate addresses Christ, and he says, what is truth? And he's looking truth right in the face, right? We say Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Truth is not a proposition, but a person. And it just so happens, in a really interesting way, postmodernity kind of gets back at what we've been saying all along, and it is this. If we want to know the truth, it's not about the data. It's not about, just look at my evidence and you'll see it has to be, the Yankees are the best, or you'll see that this church is where it's at if you just stare at it long enough. But rather, if truth is a person encountered as Jesus Christ, and there's no getting around the idea that we have a lens, then the lens through which, or through whom, we have to see the world and reality in order to see it in its truth is Jesus Christ himself. We can look at something. We could look at a rich man giving a pile of money at the temple. And we can look at a woman giving a single copper coin at the same temple. And with the objective eye, the so-called, just objective looking at things, he's obviously more dedicated to the temple than she is because he gave more. But what is the lens that Christ gives in that same account? When it happens, he turns to the disciples and he says, no, he had a lot of money, it was just a small portion of what he has. The same data, the apostles are thinking, good for him. What's she doing? But with the lens of Christ, which is truth, they are encouraged, and we all now who have heard this story, it's not a parable, it actually happened. When we hear that story, we realize, wait a second, I need to look through this with the lens of Christ. In order to get the truth of the same data, I have to see this through and in Christ. And here's the deal. Second part is going to be talking about how do we do that. If we're going to meet the challenges presented to us, we have to understand what we can talk about on that level, but also how we see what we see through the lens of Christ. Because a lot of the things that we look at, and a lot of the things that our friends, relatives, neighbors, colleagues, co-workers, who will present these challenges to us, a lot of the same information will be seen in very different ways because of the lens. And so it's about introducing them to a new way of seeing, introducing them to a way of seeing that is actually clear and pure and true because it's seeing the world through Christ who created it and sustains it. So with that, we break for lunch. Hopefully we'll chat a little bit about that, this idea that everyone looks through a lens when they look at reality. I gave some silly examples and a very serious example, but think about how do we look at something and see something very different from other people? The same thing, but we see it very differently. And what might it mean to look at reality itself, whatever that means, through the lens of Christ, who gives it its truth because he is its creator and its sustainer. All right, thank you. Happy lunching. Father?
Okay, God bless you all. Thank you so much, and thank you, Father Lucas. This is a fascinating start to the day, and I know we're all, I'm definitely looking forward to the afternoon. I'm sure we all are as well. This is going to go in some very interesting directions, and I think that the Q&A is going to be especially interesting because I'm seeing the heads move in a positive way, and each of us is bringing something from our lives that relates to what you're talking about, and what that proves out is what we started talking about at the beginning, and that is, though we may come from a variety of different cities, towns, backgrounds, and communities, the reality of our faith being pressure tested in one form or another in every relationship and circumstance that we find ourselves in the various stages of life, is simply part of the universal human Christian experience. So it's a beauty to actually talk about that and to share that struggle with one another and hopefully fight the good fight a little better by the time we leave. So thank you. We will go ahead, for those of us who are watching, we'll go ahead and stop part 1 here, and we will restart part 2 after lunch. So may the Holy Trinity bless and protect you always. I'll meet you downstairs. We'll say grace, bless the food, and then we'll come back here after. Thank you.